Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known the sound of doubt. It echoed through the hallways of Fort Campbell, whispered in the mess halls, and lingered in the briefing rooms where her male counterparts gathered. At 28 years old, she had already broken barriers that many thought impossible for women in the military. But flying an Apache helicopter in combat, that was still considered a man's domain. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Sarah walked toward her aircraft. The AH-64 Apache stood like a mechanical predator, its sleek black frame gleaming under the Kentucky sky. She had spent 3 years training on this machine, mastering every system, every weapon, every tactical maneuver. Her instructors had grudgingly admitted she was exceptional. But exceptional wasn't enough to silence the whispers. "Mitchell," called out Colonel James Harrison as he approached her aircraft. His weathered face bore the scars of 25 years in the Army, and his eyes held the skepticism that had become all too familiar to Sarah. "We need to talk." Sarah saluted crisply. "Yes, sir. I've got orders here for your deployment," Harrison said, holding up a manila envelope. "You're heading to Afghanistan. Forward Operating Base Courage in Helmand Province. Intel suggests heavy armor movement in the region." The words hung in the air between them. Afghanistan meant real combat, real enemies, and real consequences. Sarah had trained for this moment, but the weight of it settled on her shoulders like lead. "Sir, I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Harrison studied her face for a long moment. "Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you. There are a lot of people who think this is a mistake. Sending a woman to fly combat missions in an Apache. It's unprecedented. The enemy doesn't care about equal opportunity, and neither do the Taliban tanks rolling through those valleys." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "With respect, sir, my gender doesn't affect my ability to operate weapon systems or make tactical decisions. My training scores speak for themselves." "I know they do," Harrison replied, his tone softening slightly. "But scores on a training range are different from the real thing. Out there, you'll face armored divisions that have been fighting in those mountains for decades. You'll be outnumbered, outgunned, and there won't be any instructors to bail you out if things go wrong." The colonel handed her the envelope. "Your briefing is at 0800 tomorrow. You ship out in 72 hours. I suggest you use that time wisely." As Harrison walked away, Sarah opened the envelope and scanned the deployment orders. Her heart raced as she read the mission parameters. She would be assigned to Apache Squadron 7, call sign Thunder, operating out of a forward base just 30 miles from the Pakistan border. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the region, including the presence of Soviet-era T-55 tanks and more modern equipment supplied by unknown sources. That evening, Sarah sat in her small quarters, video calling her younger sister Emma back home in Ohio. Emma's face filled the laptop screen, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. "So it's really happening," Emma said, trying to keep her voice light. "My big sister is going to war. It's what I trained for," Sarah replied. "What I've wanted since I was 12 years old watching those Apache demonstrations at the air show. Remember?" Emma smiled at the memory. "You made Dad buy you every book about helicopters in the gift shop. Mom was so mad when you announced you wanted to be a combat pilot instead of going to college like a normal girl." The conversation grew quiet. Both sisters knew the statistics about combat deployments, the risks involved in flying attack helicopters in hostile territory. They also knew that Sarah would be carrying an additional burden that her male counterparts wouldn't face, the weight of proving that women belonged in combat aviation. "Sarah," Emma said softly, "you know you don't have to prove anything to anyone, right? You've already accomplished more than most people dream of." Sarah looked out her window at the Apache sitting on the tarmac under the floodlights. "Maybe. But out there, it's not about what I've accomplished in training. It's about what happens when the shooting starts. And Emma, there are people betting I'll fail." The next morning's briefing was held in a sterile conference room filled with maps, satellite photos, and the kind of tactical information that made abstract threats feel very real. Major Tom Bradley, the squadron commander, stood at the front of the room addressing the 8 pilots who would deploy together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley began, his eyes briefly pausing on Sarah, "you're heading into one of the most active combat zones in Afghanistan. Intelligence indicates enemy forces have been massing armor in the Kunar Valley region. We're talking about an estimated 40 to 50 tanks, mostly T-55 seconds but possibly some newer T-72 variants. A pilot named Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. "What kind of support are we looking at, sir?" "Limited," Bradley replied grimly. "You'll have ground forces in the area, but they're spread thin. Air support will be minimal due to other ongoing operations. For the most part, you'll be operating independently, responding to threats as they develop." Sarah studied the satellite images spread across the table. The terrain was brutal. Steep mountains, narrow valleys, and countless places for enemy armor to hide. It was exactly the kind of environment where superior numbers could overwhelm even the most advanced aircraft. After the briefing, Captain Mike Stevens, a veteran pilot with 2 previous deployments, approached Sarah. Stevens had a reputation as one of the best Apache pilots in the Army, and his opinion carried weight with the other aviators. "Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I've heard good things about your flying. Looking forward to having you on the team." Sarah shook his hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. "Thank you, sir, I won't let you down." Stevens smiled. "Call me Mike. And for what it's worth, I've seen your gunnery scores. If anyone can handle what we're walking into over there, it's you." But not everyone shared Stevens' confidence. As Sarah prepared her gear that afternoon, she overheard a conversation between 2 other pilots in the equipment room. "I still can't believe they're sending her into combat," one of them said. "It's going to be a disaster. The first time she faces real enemy fire, she'll crack. I heard she's never even been shot at." The other replied, "Training exercises don't prepare you for the real thing. When those tank rounds start flying, we'll see what she's really made of." Sarah felt her face flush with anger, but she forced herself to continue packing methodically. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only gave them more power. Instead, she channeled that anger into determination. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours, with refueling stops in Germany and Qatar. Sarah spent most of the journey reviewing tactical manuals and studying the terrain maps of their area of operations. The other pilots played cards or slept, but Sarah couldn't quiet her mind. She knew that in just a few days, she would face the ultimate test of everything she had learned. As their transport aircraft descended toward Bagram Airfield, Sarah looked out the small window at the harsh landscape below. Afghanistan stretched out in all directions. Endless mountains, deep valleys, and a terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. Somewhere in those mountains, enemy tanks were moving, and soon she would have to face them. The aircraft touched down with a jarring impact, and Sarah gathered her gear. As she walked down the cargo ramp into the blazing Afghan sun, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. She was about to become one of the first women to fly combat missions in an Apache helicopter. The success or failure of her deployment would influence military policy for years to come. Forward Operating Base Courage was exactly what its name suggested. A small outpost carved out of the hostile wilderness, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. The base housed approximately 200 soldiers, most of them infantry and support personnel. The helicopter squadron operated from a small section of the base with minimal facilities. Sarah's first night at the base was restless. The sounds of distant artillery and the occasional helicopter overhead reminded her constantly that this was no training exercise. In the morning, she would begin flying real missions over terrain controlled by an enemy that had been fighting in these mountains for generations. As she lay on her narrow cot, Sarah thought about the conversation with Colonel Harrison back at Fort Campbell. He had been right about one thing. The Taliban didn't care about equal opportunity. They would show no mercy to a female pilot, and they certainly wouldn't go easy on her because she was breaking barriers. If anything, capturing or killing the first woman to fly combat missions in an Apache would be a significant propaganda victory for them. But Sarah had not come this far to fail. She had endured years of doubt, skepticism, and outright hostility from some of her fellow soldiers. She had proven herself in every training exercise, every simulation, every test the Army could devise. Now, in the mountains of Afghanistan, she would prove herself in combat. The next morning brought her first mission briefing. Intelligence had identified enemy movement in a valley 30 miles east of the base. Ground forces were requesting air support to investigate and potentially engage hostile armor. Sarah would fly as wingman to Captain Stevens, following his lead and learning the realities of combat operations. As she walked toward her Apache in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and excitement that she had never experienced before. This was the moment she had trained for, dreamed about, and prepared for since she was a child. In a few hours, she would discover whether all that preparation was enough. The Apache's rotors cut through the thin mountain air as Sarah followed Captain Stevens through the narrow valley. Below them, the terrain stretched out like a moonscape. Rocky outcroppings, steep cliffs, and hidden ravines that could conceal an entire armored division. This was her third mission in 2 weeks, and each one had been a reconnaissance flight with no enemy contact. Sarah was beginning to wonder if she would ever face the combat she had trained so hard for. Thunder 2. This is Thunder 1. Stevens' voice crackled through her headset. Intel is reporting possible tank movement 2 clicks north of our position. Stay sharp. Sarah adjusted her grip on the controls and scanned the horizon through her helmet's targeting system. The Apache's sophisticated sensors could detect enemy vehicles from miles away. But in this terrain, visual confirmation was often the only reliable method of identifying threats. Copy, Thunder 1. Sensors are clear so far. The radio suddenly burst to life with an urgent transmission from ground control. All Thunder units, this is base control. We have troops in contact at grid reference 3847. Multiple enemy armor confirmed. You are cleared to engage. Sarah's heart rate spiked. After weeks of routine patrols, they were finally going to see action. Stevens banked hard to the left, and Sarah followed, both aircraft racing toward the coordinates provided by ground control. As they crested a ridge, the scene below them revealed itself in stark detail. A convoy of American Humvees was pinned down in a narrow valley, taking fire from at least 6 T-55 tanks positioned on the surrounding hillsides. Smoke and dust filled the air, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions. Thunder 2. I count 6 tanks in defensive positions, Stevens reported. I'm going to take the 3 on the eastern slope. You handle the western side. Remember your training and watch your altitude. Sarah's mouth went dry as she locked onto her first target. The tank was partially concealed behind a boulder, but its gun barrel was clearly visible, and she could see the flash as it fired another round toward the trapped convoy. Target acquired, she reported, trying to keep her voice steady. Western slope, tank in the rocks at bearing 270. Cleared to engage. Stevens replied. Sarah pressed the trigger, and her Apache's 30mm chain gun roared to life. The high explosive rounds tore into the enemy position, sending up clouds of dust and debris. But when the smoke cleared, the tank was still there, its main gun swiveling toward her aircraft. The enemy gunner fired, and Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the tank round screamed past her cockpit, missing by less than 50 feet. The reality of combat hit her like a physical blow. Someone was actually trying to kill her. Thunder 2, you missed your target, Stevens called out. Break left and come around for another pass. Sarah yanked her controls hard to the left, diving toward the valley floor to avoid another incoming round. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. This was nothing like training. The targets shot back, and the margin for error was measured in life and death. She climbed back to attack altitude and lined up for another shot. This time, she forced herself to breathe slowly and remember her training. The targeting computer locked onto the tank, and she fired a Hellfire missile. The explosion was devastating. The tank simply disappeared in a fireball of burning fuel and ammunition. Sarah had just scored her first kill in combat. Good hit, Thunder 2, Stevens called out. Now get the one behind the ridge. The battle continued for 30 minutes. Sarah destroyed 2 more tanks while Stevens eliminated the remaining 3. The enemy positions fell silent, and the trapped convoy was able to continue its mission. As they flew back to base, Sarah felt a mixture of elation and exhaustion that she had never experienced before, but her celebration was short-lived. The next morning brought disturbing news from intelligence sources. The 6 tanks they had destroyed were apparently just a small part of a much larger force. Satellite imagery showed massive enemy movement throughout the region, dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles converging on their area of operations. Major Bradley called an emergency briefing for all available pilots. The news was worse than anyone had expected. Gentleman and lady, Bradley began, nodding toward Sarah. We're looking at a significant enemy offensive. Intelligence estimates 40 to 50 tanks, plus infantry support, moving toward our forward positions. They're trying to cut off our supply lines and isolate the forward bases. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. What kind of support do we have, sir? Bradley's expression was grim. Minimal. The Air Force is committed to operations in other sectors. Ground reinforcements won't arrive for at least 72 hours. For now, it's just us. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. 8 Apache helicopters against 50 enemy tanks in some of the most difficult terrain in the world. The odds were not in their favor. Sir, Stevens spoke up. What's our mission priority? Are we trying to stop this offensive? Or just slow it down? Both, Bradley replied. These supply lines are critical to our operations throughout the region. If they cut us off, we'll have bases full of soldiers with no ammunition, no fuel, and no way out. Your mission is to stop this enemy advance by any means necessary. After the briefing, Sarah walked to the flight line where her Apache sat waiting. The aircraft looked different to her now. Not just a machine, but a weapon that might be the only thing standing between enemy forces and disaster for American troops throughout the region. Stevens approached her as she conducted her pre-flight inspection. How are you holding up, Mitchell? Yesterday was pretty intense. Sarah looked up from checking her aircraft's weapon systems. I'm fine, Mike. Just processing everything. It's different from what I expected. Combat always is, Stevens replied. The important thing is that you performed well under fire. That tank crew was experienced and you took them out clean. Not many pilots can say that about their first engagement. Thanks, Sarah said, feeling some of her confidence returning. But tomorrow is going to be different. 50 tanks. That's not a skirmish. That's a battle. Stevens nodded gravely. Yeah, it is. And Sarah, I want you to know something. When we go out there tomorrow, I'll be proud to have you as my wingman. Gender doesn't matter when the shooting starts. All that matters is skill, courage, and determination. You've got all three. That evening, Sarah called her sister Emma, using the base's satellite phone. The connection was poor, but she needed to hear a familiar voice before what might be her final mission. Sarah, how are you? I've been worried sick since I saw the news about fighting in your area. Sarah tried to keep her voice light. I'm okay, Emma. Just doing my job out here. How's everyone back home? Mom asks about you every day. She's proud of you. You know, we all are. Dad keeps telling everyone at work that his daughter is flying helicopters in Afghanistan. Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. Tell them I'm fine. And Emma, if something happens to me out here, I want you to know that I'm doing exactly what I always wanted to do. I'm making a difference. Nothing's going to happen to you, Emma said firmly. You're too stubborn to let a bunch of Taliban tanks stop you. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. But her mind was focused on the mission ahead. Intelligence had provided updated enemy positions, and the situation looked even worse than before. The enemy had chosen their battleground well, a series of interconnected valleys that would force the Apaches to fly low and expose themselves to ground fire. As the 8 aircraft lifted off from the base, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. All the doubt, all the skepticism, all the whispered conversations about whether women belonged in combat. None of that mattered now. She was here, she was trained, and she had a job to do. All Thunder units. This is Thunder 1. Stevens' voice came through her headset. Enemy contact expected in 15 minutes. Remember your training, watch your altitude, and keep your spacing. Today we show these bastards what American air power can do. Sarah checked her weapon systems one final time. Her Apache carried 8 Hellfire missiles, 1,200 rounds of 30mm ammunition, and enough fuel for 2 hours of combat operations. Against 50 enemy tanks, it would have to be enough. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see dust clouds rising from the valley floor, clear evidence of large vehicle movement. The enemy was there, waiting for them. In a few minutes, she would discover whether all her training and determination would be enough to survive the biggest battle of her life. The radio crackled with updates from ground observers. Thunder units. This is Overwatch. I count at least 30 tanks in the main valley, with more positioned on the ridgelines. They know you're coming. Sarah's hands tightened on her controls. 30 tanks that they could see. And who knew how many more hidden in the rocks and ravines. This would be a test not just of her flying skills, but of her courage, her judgment, and her will to survive. As they crested the final ridge before the target area, Sarah saw the full scope of what they were facing. The valley below was filled with enemy armor, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and anti-aircraft guns all positioned to create a deadly crossfire. It looked like a death trap. But Sarah had not come this far to turn back. Somewhere in these mountains, American soldiers were counting on her and her fellow pilots to stop this enemy advance. The doubters back at Fort Campbell had said women couldn't handle combat in an Apache helicopter. In the next hour, she would prove them wrong. The first missile lock alarm screamed in Sarah's cockpit as enemy anti-aircraft systems painted her Apache with targeting radar. Below her, the valley erupted in a symphony of destruction as 8 American helicopters dove into the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. "Thunder 2, break right," Stevens shouted over the radio as a surface-to-air missile streaked past Sarah's aircraft. She yanked her controls hard to starboard, her Apache spinning almost 90 degrees as she dove toward the valley floor. The enemy had prepared well. T-55 tanks were positioned in carefully chosen firing positions along the ridgelines, with newer T-72 seconds providing mobile support in the valley below. Anti-aircraft guns created overlapping fields of fire, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of positions simultaneously. "Thunder 4 is hit." Captain Rodriguez's panicked voice cut through the chaos. Sarah looked up to see Rodriguez's Apache trailing smoke and descending rapidly toward a landing zone behind enemy lines. 2 helicopters down in the first 60 seconds of combat. "Thunder units, this is Thunder 1, Stevens called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Execute attack pattern Delta. Sarah, you're with me on the eastern approach." Sarah armed her first Hellfire missile and locked onto a T-55 positioned behind a cluster of boulders. The tank's main gun was traversing toward Thunder 6, and she could see the crew preparing to fire. She squeezed the trigger, and the missile streaked away from her aircraft. The explosion sent debris flying in all directions, but Sarah was already moving, diving and weaving through the concentrated enemy fire while searching for her next target. Her training had taken over completely now. Scan, lock, fire, move. Each action flowed seamlessly into the next. "Good kill, Thunder 2, Stevens reported. "Tank at bearing 180, moving toward the ridgeline." Sarah spotted the enemy vehicle immediately. This wasn't a Soviet-era relic like most of their opponents. This T-72 was modern, well-maintained, and clearly operated by an experienced crew. As she watched, it fired its main gun, and she saw Thunder 7's Apache stagger in the air before recovering. She lined up her shot carefully, knowing that this target would be more challenging than the others. The T-72's reactive armor could potentially defeat her Hellfire missile if she didn't hit it perfectly. She waited until the tank paused to reload, then fired. The missile struck the tank's side armor and penetrated cleanly. The secondary explosion told her that she had hit the ammunition storage, and the tank was completely destroyed. But as she pulled up from her attack dive, Sarah realized that the battle was not going well for the Apache squadron. She could see only 5 other helicopters still in the air, and all of them were taking heavy fire from the remaining enemy positions. The enemy had more tanks than intelligence had estimated, and they were fighting with a coordination and skill that suggested regular military training rather than militia forces. "Thunder 1, this is base control." The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from their headquarters. "Satellite imagery shows additional enemy armor moving toward your position from the north. Estimate 20 more vehicles inbound." Stevens's response was immediate and grim. "Copy. Base control. We're already outnumbered 3-1 down here. How long until ground support arrives?" "Negative on ground support. All available units are committed to other operations. You're on your own." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They were facing 40 to 50 tanks with 6 helicopters, and now 20 more enemy vehicles were heading toward the battle. The mission had just become a fight for survival. She rolled her Apache into another attack dive, targeting a cluster of 3 tanks that had taken position in a natural amphitheater on the valley floor. These crews were clearly experienced. They had positioned their vehicles to provide mutual support while minimizing their exposure to air attack. Sarah's first missile destroyed the lead tank, but the other 2 immediately began evasive maneuvers. One disappeared behind a large rock formation, while the other began laying down suppressive fire with its machine guns, forcing her to break off her attack. As she climbed back to attack altitude, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The enemy tanks weren't just defending their positions, they were advancing. Despite taking heavy casualties from the Apache attack, they were continuing to push toward the American forward bases. "Thunder 1, they're still moving," she called out over the radio. "We're not stopping them." Stevens' response was immediate. "All Thunder units, switch to close attack formation. We're going to have to get in close and hit them hard. Sarah, you're the best shot in the squadron. I need you to take out those command vehicles." Sarah scanned the battlefield below and quickly identified what Stevens was referring to. 3 vehicles that looked different from the standard tanks, probably command and control units coordinating the enemy advance. Taking them out might disrupt the entire operation. She dove toward the first target, pushing her Apache to its limits as enemy gunfire filled the air around her. The command vehicle was partially concealed in a narrow ravine, making the shot extremely difficult. Sarah had to approach from almost directly overhead, exposing herself to fire from multiple enemy positions. As she lined up her shot, her aircraft shuddered under the impact of heavy machine gun fire. Warning lights flashed on her instrument panel, but her weapons systems were still operational. She fired her Hellfire missile at point-blank range and immediately pulled into a violent climbing turn to escape the ravine. The explosion below her was massive. Clearly, the command vehicle had been carrying extra ammunition or fuel. But as she climbed away from the target, Sarah realized that her Apache had been badly damaged. Her hydraulic systems were failing, and she could feel the controls becoming sluggish and unresponsive. "Thunder 2, you're trailing smoke," Stevens called out. "What's your status?" Sarah fought to keep her damaged aircraft stable while assessing the situation. Her engine was still running, and her weapons were operational, but she was losing hydraulic pressure rapidly. In a few minutes, she would be forced to land or risk a catastrophic crash. "Thunder 1, I've got hydraulic failure and engine damage. I can stay airborne for maybe 10 more minutes." She could hear the concern in Stevens's voice. "Roger that, Thunder 2. Start looking for a landing zone. We'll cover you." But as Sarah scanned the battlefield below, she realized that there were no safe landing zones. The entire valley was crawling with enemy forces, and any attempt to land would result in her capture or death. Her only chance was to continue fighting until her aircraft was no longer airborne. She spotted another enemy command vehicle moving along a ridge road about 2 miles from her position. This target was even more dangerous than the first. It was surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and positioned in open terrain that would expose her to fire from multiple directions. "Thunder 1, I've got eyes on another command vehicle. Grid reference 4729. I'm going after it." "Negative, Thunder 2. Stevens replied immediately. "Your aircraft is too damaged. Break off and find a place to land." But Sarah had already committed to the attack. She dove toward the target, her damaged Apache shaking violently as she pushed it beyond its safe operating limits. Enemy tracer rounds filled the air around her, and she could hear the impacts of heavy-caliber bullets against her aircraft's armor. The command vehicle crew spotted her approach and began evasive maneuvers, but Sarah had anticipated this. She led the target perfectly and fired her missile just as the vehicle tried to take cover behind a rock formation. The Hellfire struck the target directly, and Sarah watched the vehicle disappear in a massive fireball. As she pulled up from the attack, Sarah felt her control stick go completely dead. Her hydraulic system had finally failed completely, and she was now flying a 10,000-pound aircraft with virtually no control authority. But amazingly, her weapon systems were still functional. She had 4 Hellfire missiles remaining and several hundred rounds of 30mm ammunition. If she was going to crash anyway, she was determined to take as many enemy tanks with her as possible. Sarah spotted a formation of 5 T-55 tanks moving in column formation along a mountain road. They were perfectly positioned for a strafing attack, but reaching them would require flying directly through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. She rolled her crippled Apache into a steep dive, using gravity to compensate for her failed control systems. The enemy gunners saw her coming and opened fire with everything they had. Her cockpit filled with the sound of metal being torn apart as dozens of rounds found their mark. But Sarah held her dive steady, waiting until the perfect moment to open fire. When she was less than 500 feet above the enemy column, she triggered her 30mm cannon and watched her high-explosive rounds tear into the enemy vehicles. 2 tanks exploded immediately, while a third caught fire and began burning fiercely. The remaining 2 tanks scattered for cover, but Sarah wasn't finished yet. Despite her aircraft's damage, she managed to line up one more missile shot and destroyed a 4th tank before her ammunition was exhausted. As her Apache finally succumbed to its damage and began its final descent toward the valley floor, Sarah looked around the battlefield and realized something remarkable had happened. The enemy advance had stopped completely. Their command structure had been destroyed, their losses were severe, and the surviving tanks were withdrawing toward the Pakistan border. Stephen's voice crackled through her headset one final time. Thunder 2. You've done something incredible down here. I count 47 enemy vehicles destroyed, and the advance has been stopped completely. You single-handedly turned the tide of this battle. Sarah's Apache hit the ground hard, but she survived the crash with only minor injuries. Within an hour, American ground forces had secured the area and evacuated her to safety. The enemy offensive had been completely defeated, and the supply lines to the forward bases remained secure. News of the battle spread quickly through military channels and eventually reached the media. The story of a female Apache pilot who had single-handedly destroyed 47 enemy tanks became an instant sensation. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the headlines or the medals that followed. The real victory was the silence from those who had once doubted whether women belonged in combat aviation. When Colonel Harrison visited her in the hospital at Bagram Airfield, his words were simple but profound. "Mitchell," he said, shaking her hand, "you've proven something important today. Not just about women in combat, but about what courage and determination can accomplish against impossible odds. The military is a better institution because of what you did in that valley." Sarah would go on to complete her deployment and return home to a hero's welcome. She would eventually be promoted to major and become an instructor at the Army's Apache training school, where she would help train the next generation of combat pilots. But she would never forget the day in the Afghan mountains when she proved that skill, courage, and determination mattered more than anyone's preconceptions about gender and combat. In a valley full of enemy steel, she had shown that the most important weapon in any aircraft was the person flying it.